asking if there are any additions to the agenda. David?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. One item under other business, and that would be the OSUM conference.
The what?
OSUM.
OSUM, okay. Anything else? Are there any deletions? Seeing none, would someone move that the agenda be approved? Brian, seconded by John. All those in favor? Opposed? The motion is carried. There is the provision for the declaration of pecuniary interest. If you have an interest, declare it at the appropriate time. And we have actually under 4, we have 2 delegations and 1 education session. So I'm going to treat the delegations accordingly, and we'll have the education session, which will have a little bit different rules, et cetera, for procedure. So let's begin by asking Colleen Durham, who is here, to come forward to the podium and speak into the microphone, hopefully. And she has a request for council to revisit the decision to prohibit raising chickens in areas not zoned agriculture. And just before Colleen begins, I will note that there was attached information concerning the issue circulated with the agenda package. So Colleen is here to speak to her presentation and perhaps answer any questions that committee may have. Colleen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Bear with me, I'm not much of a public speaker, so I'm going to try and do this as briefly as possible. I live in the village of Burford in the county of Brant. Recently I retired, and I thought that maybe I could have a few backyard chickens, both to enjoy for raising the eggs as well for my grandchildren. Sorry. Unfortunately, after doing some research into this, I found out that under the County of Brant's bylaws, because I'm in an urban area and not zoned agricultural, I cannot have chickens. I also discovered that this has been a problem in the past and brought before council and voted against. My hope is that the dialogue can be reopened. In my investigations on the issue of backyard hens, how to raise them, the pros and cons of both, I discovered that many cities, including Kitchener, Woodstock, Brampton, Niagara, and Guelph, just to name a few, permit the raising of hens in limited numbers without roosters in residential backyards, except for Brantford, which is currently revisiting the issue of removing roosters from the backyards. Document number 2 deals with the municipality comparison chart, shows you which areas allow chickens, what the backyard restrictions are, the town restrictions are, etc. So you can review that at your will. Our participating areas have strict guidelines on the number of chickens allowed, roosters restrictions, registration guidelines, and the property size, as well as other factors. As well, I've also included 2 detailed reports, one from the City of Cambridge outlining the rules and restrictions for raising backyard chickens, which is article number 3, and the second, more recent article, number 4, is from Norfolk County and the changes being initiated to allow the constituents to raise backyard hens. The City of Toronto is also conducting a trial, which is not yet complete, on this issue. There are numerous articles on the internet addressing both the risks and benefits, sustainability, food, education for both young and old, as well as mental health benefits are discussed. We are the County of Brant, made up of small towns and villages in a rural setting that many of us have chosen to live in and be part of, not the larger cities which seem to be successfully implementing what I am asking to be addressed. Many of our roots come from agriculture, and we are a community with the setting that should be conducive to such an endeavor. We're not looking to infringe upon the agricultural community that raises chickens and eggs on a large scale for industrial purposes. I am not asking to raise many of the exotic animals currently listed in the bylaw. Many are there for justifiable reasons. I'm just asking the council consider this proposal, review the submitted information, and speak to the communities that have allowed this for their residents. Thank you for taking your time to listen to me and your consideration in this matter.
Thanks, Colleen. Committee members, this is the opportunity if you have any questions to Colleen about the issue she's being presented. Questions of clarification only. We're not going to debate the issue at this point, but we will at the appropriate time. So are there any questions from committee to Colleen? I see no one with questions, so I will thank you for your presentation, and committee will deal with this at the conclusion of the other delegation.
Okay, thank you
Thanks,
very
Colleen.
much.
Okay, the next delegation is Maggie Adams is here to request for the Ram Rodeo event to be designated or declared a municipally significant event for the purposes of the Alcohol and Gaming Commission. And Maggie is coming forward and will follow Colleen's excellent example on how to make a presentation, as long as you pull that microphone down in front of your, there you go.
Thank you.
You're all set.
Okay, my name is Maggie, and I didn't come with a prepared speech, but as Robert was saying, I am working on the Burford Ram Rodeo. I had found this one woman who's extremely good when it comes to catering services for bartending services, to help me with the rodeo this year. Her name is Colleen Adams. She's a licensed manufacturer, representative of AGCO. And I heard of her from somebody else's, somebody else had a rodeo last year at St. Thomas, the first time, and he used her services, and he was extremely pleased with what she had to offer. And she was very polite to his people that came to watch his rodeo. She looked after everything. She was very professional. She was very clean. She was very attentive, and he really enjoyed her help in making his rodeo a success. So she will be looking after the fencing. She'll buy all the liquor for me. She'll provide the bartenders, the insurance, and I was just hoping that, with your permission, I can go ahead and continue with her and make it a great success in Burford.
Okay, thank you, Maggie. The request is fairly straightforward. Are there any questions to Maggie at this time? John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to the presenter. You're asking that we make this event a significant municipal event.
I am.
What's the reason for that? Is that an AGCO requirement?
It is.
And
I
if we
believe it is.
don't,
That's what she's asked for, yes.
and if we don't make it a municipal, significant municipal event, does that mean you can't do it?
Well, yes. It's just that because I've got, my deadline is supposed to be like 30 days, and I've surpassed that 30-day deadline, and this was the route that I was told I should be taking. I don't want any headaches with this. The Legion, I've approached the Legion. Last year we did have the Legion. They worked quite nicely with us, but this year the Legion, there's nothing to draw the people into the Legion this year, and I just want to make this as easy as I could possibly. And it's just another alternative for the town to make a little extra money this way.
Are there any other questions? Joan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When is the rodeo?
The rodeo is going to be Saturday, June 8th, and Sunday, June 9th.
Thank you.
Okay, I see no further questions, so I will thank you for your presentation, and momentarily the committee will deal with the requests.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So before we go on to the education session, let's deal with the delegations. First of all, with regard to Colleen Durham's request for council to revisit the raising of chickens in areas other than agricultural areas or zones. How does committee wish to deal with that? David?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll first move that we receive it. Second of all, given that we've discussed this, 6 of us, or 5 of us, whatever, have discussed this in depth last term of council, what I would like to do is maybe circulate the same staff report. I wish I had the date. I was looking, I didn't have enough time. It was from early 2016. What I would suggest is that report be circulated to members of this committee for the next CDC meeting, so that we're all on the same page and we can discuss it then, and it gives us another month to do our own research. That's
So
the
I will
motion.
take that as a motion. Do I have a
Yes.
seconder? Seconded by Mayor David. essentially to receive the request to circulate what I'll call accumulated information and to place it on next committee agenda. Any questions to the resolution? All those in favor? Opposed? That motion is carried. So Colleen, that issue will be on our desk at our next planning committee meeting, or our next CDC meeting, which will be a month approximately from today. Let's deal with the request from Maggie Adams. How does committee wish to do with that? Brian?
Chair, I will move that we make this a municipally significant event. Seeking seconder.
Rather than shout it out, just put up your hand so I can, because there was a couple got up there ahead of time. So it's moved by Brian, seconded by John. Are there any questions? John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to staff, I suspect there is also a rodeo here in Paris, and I can't remember exactly when it is going to be. I presume that we would give that the same status?
Only if it's asked for and only if committee agrees.
Okay, thank
A
you.
request could be made.
Thank you.
I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? That motion is carried. So the event has been recommended to council to be considered a municipally significant event. That final decision will be made by council at the council meeting at the end of the month. Or no, actually, there's a special council meeting scheduled at the end of this meeting to deal with that because there's time issues that are in play. Okay, that deals with the delegations. And now we have an education session on the harassment and violence in the workplace. And Karen is here to make the presentation. I have been informed that her presentation is roughly 15 to 20 minutes in duration, and that'll leave 5 or 10 minutes for questions or comments afterward. If committee will indulge the presenter by holding your questions to the appropriate time, I may interrupt at certain times to allow for questions, but it may be at the end of the presentation. We'll see how the presentation goes. If you do think you have a question, just indicate to me, and I'll kind of tabulate and try and work it in at the appropriate time. So, Karen, do you have the tools to make the presentation move smoothly? Okay.
It looks like I do.
I will turn the meeting over to Karen.
All right. Good evening, everyone. So my name is Karen Dropko. I work in the HR department here at the county, and I've been asked to come in and give you an education session on our prevention of harassment and violence in the workplace. So if you'll indulge me for a few minutes, I'll give you a brief overview of the training we provide to all of our staff. So we're going to go through a couple definitions at a high level at this point in time. The first being, actually, I'm going to give you why we're doing this. Bill 168 means that we need to have policies in the workplace that outline our plans for the prevention of violence and harassment in the workplace. So we have those posted in all of our work sites, and we also have to train our staff and counsel on these policies. We also have to have programs in place involving how we handle complaints, reporting, investigation, documentation, and we also have to have a plan in place for if anybody is dealing with domestic abuse. So next slide is the definition of violence in the workplace. So I'm not going to read this whole slide to you because I'm sure everybody can see it. I think it's summed up pretty well by the sentence at the very bottom that says, the punch that hit, the punch that missed, and the threat of a punch. So you don't have to be injured in order for it to be considered violence. It just needs to have the intent or the threat of violence. The definition of harassment in the workplace is engaging in a course of vexation conduct or comment against a worker in a workplace that is known or ought reasonably known to be unwelcome. A couple highlights on this one are in a course of, so it means repeated events. It's not just a single event. And vexatious, which is another word for annoying or irritating. And then on to bullying. So any behavior that intimidates, humiliates, offends, or demeans a person or a group of people. We need to be able to distinguish between normal workplace conflict and bullying. So it is repeated, persistent, continuous behavior, and it could be verbal, nonverbal, psychological, or against a group. We also have Bill 132, where the Government of Ontario continued to move towards an action plan by introducing Bill 132, and that's Sexual Violence and Harassment Action Plan. So it served to clarify and expand on current violence and harassment policies. So again, I'm not going to read the fairly wordy definition there for you, but it is up there. And again, it talks about vexatious comment and in a course of. So typically it's not just one single event. We also like to point out what isn't harassment. So in a work setting, harassment isn't a manager or supervisor trying to fairly evaluate employees, discipline for misconduct, or ask them to provide medical documents to support an absence from work. It also isn't personalities and conflicts happening. You really need to take a step back and see, is this a normal workplace conflict, or has this escalated into a harassment or bullying situation? So what should you do if you see bullying or harassment or sexual harassment? So if you see it, you can name it and stop it. Tolerance does not equal permission, so if this is happening to someone and they don't say no, it doesn't mean that they're giving that person permission to treat them that way. We tell staff to keep copies of any emails, memos, voicemails that they consider harassing. They're asked to write down the facts, any witnesses, the outcome of the event, to report the situation, and do not retaliate, because if we have to go in and do some sort of investigation, it just muddies the water as to who did what and under what circumstance. So we're going to shift gears a little bit now from harassment into prevention of violence in the workplace. And so we teach our staff, and we're teaching you how to deal with difficult people. I'm going to give you some tools to use. I have no magic phrases or words, just some ideas to keep for if you end up dealing with a difficult person. We're going to learn how a crisis develops and how to recognize the different stages, how to react appropriately to a stage, and the focus here is on prevention and de-escalation before somebody becomes violent.
Karen, just before you get into the stages, let me ask, are there any questions so far? Any fairly straightforward? Seeing none, you're doing a good job.
So this is the model that we use to train our staff, and it shows 4 different stages. 3 distinct stages, and a resolution. So the first stage is anxious, the second is defensive, the third is physical violence, and the fourth is tension reduction, which is what we're all aiming for, and that's where the person calms down. So the key is to match your response to the behavior, understanding how to appropriately respond, being not to overreact and not to underreact, will help reduce tensions. So the first stage is anxious. So the definition of this is an increase or change in behavior. So if you are speaking with somebody and you see their behavior change, they start to speak a little bit more rapidly, they start to fidget, they start to avoid your eye contact, things like that. It may be that this person is getting anxious, which is the first step towards a crisis, potentially. And so our response to that would be to be supportive. We want to help make that person feel at ease. So we want to help them and ask things like, what can I do for you? How can I help you? Are there any questions I can answer for you? One of the very important things about this part is to pay attention to your nonverbal, your paraverbal communication. So that's the link between our body language and the words that we use. So we really want to make sure that we're watching our tone, our volume, and our speed. So if somebody is quickening up their rate of speech, we want to make sure that we don't follow suit, because that's going to make it look like I'm getting anxious as well. So I'm going to make sure that my speed is measured and my tone is measured to help kind of model the calm response and hopefully bring that person into a calmer state. We want to pay attention to their body language as well. If for some reason our modeling of calm behavior doesn't help them out of that anxious second stage, which is defensive. So that's when somebody may start to lose their rationality and become non-compliant. So they may start to refuse to follow direction, they may become belligerent, be sarcastic, be argumentative, and this one's a little bit more serious because it's getting closer towards a potentially violent situation. This is where we move from asking, what can I do, to telling, here's what I need you to do. So we go from being supportive to being directive. We need to take control of the situation. Defensiveness comes in a few different stages. Typically, one stage happens after the other. Simple, be direct, and be professional when somebody is being defensive with us. So the first stage of defensive behavior is questioning. There's two types of questions. One is information seeking, and those are pretty simple. It's where do I need to file this, or what's the deadline for that? And we just give as much information to answer the question as we can. The second type of questioning, which is challenging, is far more difficult because they're not necessarily looking for an answer, but to engage you in an argument. So that's where you really need to focus on staying on topic, avoiding a power struggle, and declining the invitation to argue. The next one is refusal. So somebody now becomes non-compliant, and this is where we need to learn how to set appropriate limits. We need to allow time for the person to make their decisions, because at this point in time, they're not necessarily thinking rationally and might not be taking all of the information that you're providing in at the same time. We need to stay on topic and on task. So we always teach our staff the keys to setting limits. You need to be simple and clear. They need to be reasonable. So you don't want to ask, if somebody's yelling at you at this point in time, what you want to ask them to do is quiet down. You're not asking them for an apology at this point in time because that's not necessarily reasonable. We want to take it one step at a time. And it needs to be enforceable. So if I set a limit for somebody, I'm not going to tell them, you know, if you don't quiet down, I'm going to have to remove you right from this room. It's going to be, if you don't lower your voice, I'm going to have to end this conversation. So it needs to be enforceable. The next stage in defensive behavior is an outburst, and this is where somebody may vent. And that's okay, because the person is expending energy, and really that's what we want them to do. We don't want to gain energy, we want them to expend it. So we want to make sure there's not a lot of people around to provide an audience to them, but we want to let them say their piece. We want to make sure we continue to state our limits and continue to be reasonable, continue to be professional, and be able to enforce our limits if necessary. If they escalate further, it may be that they come to the intimidation phase. And at this point, we need to take all threats seriously. We don't want to be alone with this person at this point in time. So when they're venting, we want to remove the audience. But if you have somebody who's trying to intimidate you, you don't want to be alone with them if possible. We want to make sure that there's somebody who's around who can help if necessary. End the interaction if they don't follow directions or limits. So if it's a phone call, we tell the staff, you can end the phone call at this point in time. You can leave the meeting, you can leave the room. If there is a threat of physical violence, certainly we request that they report it up to their supervisor and call the police if necessary. And then the final step, which is what we're trying to avoid, is physical violence. And we rarely get to this stage, because hopefully when you're supportive with an anxious person or directive with a defensive person, we're not going to get to this stage. But the definition we're going to use here now is a loss of physical and emotional control, behavior that poses an immediate threat to you and others. So again, it's the punch that hits, the punch that missed, and the threat of a punch. So it can be injury, it can be intent, it could be a threat. So our direction to staff is at this point, get help from whoever you can, a supervisor, a coworker, a member of the public if necessary. Call the police. You need to seek immediate help, and your goal is to keep yourself safe and the safety of others around you. If you need to leave the area, that is perfectly acceptable. If you need to clear the area, that is perfectly acceptable as well. What we're ultimately going for is tension reduction. And so that's the decrease in physical and emotional energy. The person regains control of their emotions, their behavior, and rationality. You may never see this. If somebody gets frustrated with you in the defensive stage and hangs up the phone or stalks out of a meeting or leaves the situation, that's okay, because that person did not become violent. They caught themselves, they removed themselves from the situation. And if they need to double back to you later to resolve the conflict, chances are they're going to come back a little bit calmer, and you'll be able to pick up where you left off and solve the situation. So chances are you might not see this, and that's okay. Signs that someone might be calming down is that their voice is lowering, their speech is slowing down, they're willing to re-engage in the conversation instead of just provoking an argument, and that's okay. You also need to make sure that after the situation, you take a moment to let yourself calm down as well before you have to deal with the next person who comes along, because you may carry the weight of the last conversation with you into the next conversation, and chances are that's not going to work well for anybody involved. So we tell our staff, take 5 minutes, calm down, talk about it, take a break, and then deal with the next person in line or the next phone call or whatever it is that you need to do. Because we don't want to be part of the problem, we need to be part of the solution. Another thing we tell our staff as well is that it's very important to maintain your professionalism through the entire interaction. It's next to impossible to let your emotions get away from you and get them back. So we want them to set up the professionalism, maintain the professionalism, and it's much easier to get through that if you keep it the entire time. And that is a record-breaking whirlwind tour of our training. So again, this is the summary. When they're anxious, you're supportive. When they're defensive, you're directive. If they're physically violent, you keep yourself safe, and we're looking for tension reduction, which is where somebody calms down. Anybody have any questions?
Any questions? I have one.
Yes.
Which may lead into another question. And it is just hypothetically, let's say a dispute started between two members of committee or council, and it escalates to the point where it's obvious that one is threatening the other and the other is threatening back. What is the role of the other members of the committee? What is the role of the chairman? And what is the role of the staff CAO in that situation? So let's hypothetically suggest that Brian gets into a heated argument with John McAlpine, of all people. and it gets to the point where Brian is pounding his fists on the table and John is standing up, screeching back. What are we supposed to do if that happens? Not that it ever will. What am I supposed to do as chairman or any other chairman? And what is the CA supposed to do, in your educated opinion?
Well, I am not well versed in the roles of committee and chairman. However, as the person of authority in the room, I would think that as a chairman, you would say, there's obviously a conflict happening here and it is escalating quickly. We need to take a break and stop it in its tracks and let people have a few minutes to calm down, to leave the room, to get a drink,
somebody.
Of water.
Of water, yes. Soft drink, tea, whatever it is. It may be that somebody ends up leaving the meeting if it is that heated at that point in time that they're not able to calm down enough to carry forth on the rest of the meeting. If it gets to be that bad, then there should be a follow-up after the fact when people have calmed down to find out, is this an ongoing thing? Is this a one-time thing? Can they talk about it together with some mediation? Do we need to look at other options to help settle this?
So the responsibility, the immediate responsibility would be fall on the chair of the meeting,
I would think so.
and then the responsibility would fall on the other members of the committee to support the chair. And I don't know, what would the CAO do, if anything? Just kind of,
Yeah,
what would
go
you
for
do
it.
in that situation?
Mr. Chair, and I think what Karen said is appropriate. So all of us at the staff level, we've all taken violence in the workplace training, much more extensive than this. So we are schooled in techniques that we could use depending on the situation. At a certain point of the situation, then I have a responsibility to my staff, and I think broader to council, to then start asking people to get out of the room if I think it goes that far. And I would, at some point, would probably engage the police. I would reach out for help, as Karen said. So and again, I would be looking at our team, and I think several of us have taken various levels of education in this area, and we would act appropriately. So, but I think Karen was right on in the initial stages of that.
Okay, what would you do, Mark?
Well, I'm a certified understanding and managing aggressive behavior trainer, so I could go into physical restraints if I needed to. But I actually have a question regarding, there's another council, not that far from here, where a counselor is barred from the building due to inappropriate behavior, but there's a conflict with the ability and right to represent constituents. I don't think we're ever going to get there, but has HR looked into that situation? Are they aware of that situation to maybe develop some policies for the future, just in case, you know, John McAlpine and Brian Coleman are barred from the premises one day?
So we don't have anything like that in place right now, but it's certainly something we can look into.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks. Yep.
And there is the ever popular code of conduct that we're obliged to follow, and I think we rely on that extensively. And now that John and Brian have made up, are there any final questions to Karen or anyone else for that matter? Okay, thanks, Karen.
Thank
It was
you.
a good presentation.
You taking control of this?
And that allows us to continue on with the agenda and go to the minutes of the previous meeting. Would someone feel comfortable in moving that the minutes be adopted? David and Brian, are there any errors or omissions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Minutes are adopted. Business arising from the minutes. Committee will recall this motion that the grant request for Mackenzie Creek Music Fest for $1,000 be approved was presented, moved and seconded as the agenda suggests at our last meeting, and that resolution was deferred until this a meeting for additional information. So I will place the motion back on the table. It's moved by Councillor Wheat, seconded by Councillor Pierce, that the grant request from Mackenzie Creek Music Fest for $1,000 be approved. Joan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did get additional information from Mr. Williams. When I read the agenda, I was quite concerned, and I think that this is an important event for the area of the county that doesn't have a lot of events. Don't think they asked for any grants. The money from the event covers youth darts. They have quite a big dart league. Young people go there, and there's like 12 dart boards. And they purchase baseball equipment for youth baseball, and I'm told a special glove was purchased for a handicapped child. They need the money for advertising this event, and it says here, I'm supposed to check with Russell Press, and apparently Murray Williams has said that Russell Press, he talked to him, felt it was a good event for the county to get behind, as he felt we need more events in the county to bring in tourist money. That part has grown where people have driven hours to catch the music at this event. So, yeah, I do know that a lot of people come from out of town. I've been asked about this event because country and western music lovers want to come to it. So they've never asked for a grant before, so I'm hoping we can support this.
Any other comments? John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, if it wasn't for the conversation that Councillor Gatward had in the other room and the conversation she just had here, none of what she said is on the additional information we received when the question was asked what this is going to be for, other than advertising for the event. So I'm curious as to why all this information wasn't put into that. But that's, and then it's kind of unfortunate when they finished their little letter there with, I didn't have an official report, so I figured we were going to be turned down. We can always try next year. Okay, that's my comment.
Are there any other comments? John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just following up on what John has mentioned there, I think if we donate funds that we believe ultimately contribute to a donation to a charity, it would be appropriate to make sure that we do know they get to that charity. So if this venture, it's not clear to me from the note from Will, who must be Murray Williams, I guess, not sure whether they make a profit, although from what Joan has just said, it sounds like they do. But I think it would be just good practice to feedback and say, if we grant you this, we would like to see some evidence that you actually hand over, you make a profit, and then we might even be considering to be more grateful, more willing to support in future years.
Any final comments before I call the question? Again, it's been moved and seconded. The previous meeting deferred till this meeting, so the motion is on the table that the grant of $1,000 be approved. If there are no final questions, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? The motion is carried. That recommendation will go to council. And that concludes that item of business, and that takes us to the consent items. And in the consent item agenda, there are several recommendations and several items to be received. Would someone, well, first let me ask, is there any item that anyone wants removed from the consent agenda at this time? David?
Item number 5, since it requires a motion.
Item number 5 in the consent items to be approved. Anything else? Would someone move that, with the exception of number 5, that the consent items that are listed to be approved and the consent items that are listed to be received be approved and received? Moved by Mayor David, seconded by Mark. All those in favor? Motion is carried. Let's deal with recommendation number 5. David? David asked that it be removed, so David,
Well,
how do you
I
wish
know,
to deal with it?
sorry, Mr. Chair, I know Joan is directly involved with that, and I thought she would want to move that.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Miller. I appreciate that. This is a very lengthy
So you're moving it, first of all?
proclamation. Yes.
Okay, let's do it the way it's supposed to be done. It's moved by Councillor Gatward, second by Councillor Miller, that that recommendation be before us. Are there any questions? Are there any comments? Joan?
The clerk advised me before the meeting that it still has to come to council for the proclamation to be official. So I guess it's still in time because Crime Week is May 26th to June 1st. And I just wanted to make sure that we get our notices out about this to all our customer service offices in time for this particular week. So,
And that is noted. So I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? That recommendation is carried. There are no committee reports, and that takes us to staff reports, corporate services. There's a report from General Manager Hewitt with regard to the employee benefits renewal. Would someone feel comfortable in moving that recommendation? Moved by Brian, seconded by Steve. Are there any questions? All those in favor? Opposed? That motion is carried. It's the General Manager. Robin is not here, so Heather Mifflin is standing in for the General Manager.
I just have one, through you, Mr. Chair, I just have one quick item. In my DC status update report, there was the second stakeholder meeting is scheduled in there for May 23rd. We've actually moved that meeting to May 30th. So the background study will still be released on the 23rd. You'll have a whole week to read it, and then the second meeting, stakeholders meeting, will be on May 30th at the Lafarge Building in the afternoon. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. David?
A question for Heather, if I could. Through you, Mr. Chair, to Heather. Thank you, Heather, for the update. I want to ask you two questions. You might not know the second one, but hopefully you know the first one. When social services was here during budget, they challenged us to say that we should be starting a fund for affordable housing. It's interesting, when we were on our walkabout of the businesses the other day, that was brought up. There's no affordable housing anywhere. And I don't see affordable housing on our DCs, but I understand other municipalities have them. Do you know if that's the case?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I've heard that. No, we don't currently carry affordable housing in our DC. We're not the provider, so it's not one that we're right out there, but we can investigate it with the consultant to see if that can be incorporated in ours as well.
If you could find that out, and I know Councillor Bell and Councillor LaFerriere and the mayor also, I think you guys were wondering the same thing, because we all heard the same message. They will be coming here to speak to us. I don't know if they're coming to CDC or council, but yeah. And I think we all are aware of the housing issue. So if you could look into that, I would very much appreciate it. Second question, and you might not know, but it's the public transportation RFP, I understand, is going out this Thursday.
That would be a Cindy question.
Is that a Cindy question?
Okay, we'll get to Cindy in a minute. If that concludes your questions, then
Yeah,
I will ask. I think there was another hand up here. Okay, thanks, Heather. And we'll move on to the operations. And the general manager has a short report or an update.
Good evening. Through the chair to committee. Just wanted to let committee know that on Wednesday, May 15th, the tender for Rest Acres Road will close. What that means is it will not be going to Public Works tomorrow, but will come directly to council at the end of the month. So I just wanted council to know that, so when you see that in your package as to why that occurred. We ran into a couple of problems with the timing of our tenders, and the most recent one is there's two other huge projects which were closing at exactly the same time, and that's really not a good idea to be messing with a situation like that.
Okay. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
Now, the general manager of Community and Protective Services indicated that she had no report, but apparently there is a question, so I'll ask Cindy to come forward. And David, you had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Cindy, are you looking after the public transportation RFP?
Yes,
That's going out-
our department is, yeah.
Okay, sorry. And that's going out this Thursday?
Not this Thursday. My understanding was it was going to be going out by the end of the month. The expression of interest closed about a week ago, and we received interest from 13 organizations. But I do know that staff are working on finalizing the RFP right now.
Who would be the lead staff person on that?
Leslie Head.
Okay, I'll speak to Leslie. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions to the general manager? Joan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Were you aware of the public transportation coming into the county currently from Ride Norfolk? They're stopping in Oakland and Mount Pleasant 3 times daily, and they're coming from Simcoe to Brantford.
Is that a question or an announcement?
No, I asked her if she was aware. It was a
Are
question.
you aware of that?
And it could be an announcement, too.
I think it was more of an announcement than a question.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I did actually see that on social media. I just saw an advertisement around that. We haven't looked into that in great detail, but I did hear about that.
Because when they were talking about the tender, I didn't know what's in it.
Okay, I think we've got that announcement/question
Thank you.
dealt with, so we'll move on. Are there any other announcements or questions? Mark?
The county did write a letter of support for those stops. I think it was Staff Eric. So just happened to know because I happened to be chatting with her about some other stuff. So there wasn't, just now that it's out there, it's sort of, I guess, announcement, but that it wasn't unbeknownst to the county that that stops started coming out in the county. But it's really well appreciated and shows good potential for the future.
Okay, then, thanks, Cindy. We'll try and hold the questions rather than announcements next time you're up here. Development Services, it's been indicated to me that the general manager has no update. Any questions to the general manager? Seeing none, let's move on to strategic investments, and Allison is here. First of all, let's deal with the recommendation that's before us. Does someone feel comfortable in moving that recommendation? John, seconded by John McAlpine, Pierce. Are there any questions? Comments? I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. And Allison, do you have an update for us? Allison is shaking her head. She has no update. So let's move right on to the CAO's portion of the agenda, and there is a recommendation attached there, recommendation number 1. It's moved by Steve. Do I have a seconder? John Pierce. Are there any questions? This is a kind of a lengthy report. I'm sure everyone has read it. And I'm not going to ask the CAO to regurgitate it, but if there are any questions, let's deal with questions, then comments, and maybe the discussion will flow out of that. So are there any questions? David?
Yes, just one from me, Mr. Chair. And 3 to Michael. Really good information. They're fantastic. Kudos to you and all the staff that put that stuff together. I thought it was fantastic. My question is, do the OPP have a monopoly on stopping speeders? Maybe you don't know, but I would really be interested in finding out. Because a lot of times, a resident will call us, call a counselor, and say they're speeding on this road, and I'll talk to Joan or talk to the inspector directly, and they'll maybe they'll put a patrol out there for a couple days, and it helps, whatever. But then they go away because staff resources for the OPP are limited because they're expensive. But I mean, is there any reason why somebody else couldn't do speed control, or where would I go for that information?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't know the exact answer to that question. It's my understanding at a high level is that the speed control is enforced through the Highway Traffic Act. And the municipality, and they list a bucket of things that the municipality can do. The enforcement of the Highway Traffic Act is not in that. I see some nodding at the side there, so I think I'm on the right track. Now, there was a few years ago, the OPP, and it was discussed, I remember at Police Services Board, about bringing civilians in to do traffic control. I don't know where that's at. So that's a question that perhaps I could either ask the detachment commander or maybe one of the Police Services Board members could bring up at the Police Services Board. So that's my understanding at this point.
Okay, no, thank you. I'll follow up. That's okay. I just thought that might have been something that come out when this report was produced, but I guess not. Okay, thank you.
Let me ask if there are any other questions at this time, clarification to the report itself. Joan and then Mark. Question, Joan?
I thought I read somewhere this afternoon that speeding only caused 1.7% of collisions. Is that correct? Because I can't find it now. There's only 4 listed there. And I didn't add them up to see if they're 100%, but is that, where does it say that?
Perhaps you can search through and find the answer to your own question if it is in there.
Sorry.
Page 2, paragraph 3.
First.
Mark, question.
I don't want you to regurgitate, through you, Mr. Chair, to the CEO, I don't want you to regurgitate the report, but I do think I would appreciate a little discussion about a term in here that I understand, but I have a feeling it might come up. So I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit more and clarify.
Mark, we're not going to ask for a discussion. If you have a question
I
on
have
the
a
report.
question, yeah. If you let
Okay,
me,
well, let's
I
ask
was
the
right
question.
at it. With 10 more seconds, I probably would have got there. Could you please discuss a little bit about what road dieting might look like in the county, specific to this report?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. So road dieting, and it's based on my research, is basically, so if you think of the road and you put the road on a diet, it gets thinner. And I think that's the reason for the word road diet. And so it's basically taking constraining the driving surface to make it, for lack of a better term, a bit harder to drive on. And so the road diet can be created through line painting. It can be created through those little bollards or pylons, kind of permanent pylons that can be mounted into the road. It can be through actual curbs, the construction of concrete curbs. So, Initiative 2 in the report kind of uses those simpler things, those more quickly deployed things, and then Initiative 4, which is the bigger and very similar to what we're doing on Rest Acres Road and what's being proposed for Grand River Street North, the installation of permanent structures to basically put the road on a diet, constrain that driving surface, and therefore influence the behavior of drivers to drive more slowly. So.
Any other questions? John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Michael. I see that you indicate photo radar is not ready for us. Do you know when the regulatory issues will be resolved?
Mr. Chair, yeah, through you, no, we don't. Ms. Zudema did some research on it. At this point, it seems to have just stalled at the province. That would be my kind of understanding. So we don't have a date on that. And noting that what was proposed in the legislation was fairly limited. It wasn't widespread photo radar. It's more constrained. So.
Any other questions of clarification on the report? Then let's go to comments. Any comments? The mover, Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say, to echo a little bit, the appreciation for the work that went into this report, and it's such a thorough report. I think it's going to deliver benefits county-wide, so I obviously wholeheartedly support it. And I just suggest, this is not an amendment suggestion, just more of a staffing suggestion, that we, if this is passed tonight and at council, it would be great to, through our communication division, have the entire report, with or without the dollars portion, on the county website as soon as possible. I think there are a lot of people in our community who would appreciate the details and would see the benefit in this. Thank you.
Well said. Any other comments? Joan and then David. Go ahead, Joan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I was pleased to see all the information, and if we're going to put this out to the public, I spoke to the CAO about some changes that I wanted to attachment 1. So I'm hoping that can be done, because if it's going public, the people in Oakland read that, they're going to say, what? Because it's supposed to be changed a bit, that's all. Thank you. And I'll speak to it. Or do you want me to tell you the changes?
If they're minor in detail and the CAO is amenable, I think
Okay.
minor editing is
Thank you.
permissible. Thanks, Joan. David, and then John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just in regards, because Council Bell, you brought up, and it is in the report, photo radar. I do know out in Alberta, they tried it for a year or 2 years, and they just discontinued it for, they said there was a variety of reasons, but I thought that was interesting, so I don't know. But that was their experience, so thank you.
John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm a passionate advocate of photo radar. It's in my experience in Europe, it is the single most effective tool to stop persistent speeders from speeding. We all have the occasion when we speed and we realize it and we slow down. There are some people who speed, and only when they're caught and only when they're fined and only when their license is removed or is partially removed do they feel the need to actually stop driving too fast. So I would ask that when this report includes a line that says when the photo radar regulations are clear, that they're brought back to this committee and that we consider including them as part of this strategy. My other comment is this is a great document. I'm fully supportive of it. I just want to make just one little tale. I am a pace car driver already, which frustrates 90% of the population. And my little piece of data, driving along Governor's Road earlier today, at the posted speed, I was passed by 9 cars in the space of 3 minutes. And I think the secret to that will be more people doing it. So I applaud that. I'd never seen this before. I think if we can put get a lot of people on board with this idea, it would be wonderful. Final thought, we have almost every public works meeting somebody coming in asking us to reduce the speed limit or do something that improves the road safety of their particular area. I think it would be appropriate for us to recognize those people that have come and that we have said we'll hold that over until we have our safe driving or speeding strategy worked out. Let's make sure we include them on the list of people that are addressed by attachment 1. I know there are 1 or 2 that are not there, and perhaps, Michael, if you could just coordinate with Rob Walton, he's got the list of the people that have been to us, and we give that message to them. Thank you.
Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Councillor Miller and I attended the OSAM conference, and one of the best presentations I've ever seen was a speed control traffic calming presentation. And what I'm really impressed with is this was very, up to date, experts in the field, and in-house, the staff here were able to deliver a document that had pretty much all of the top-notch, top-of-the-line data all there that, we'd pay experts tons of money to create, and they were able to create it in-house. So that's really wonderful. It's really wonderful to see this presentation match so closely what we were presented at that excellent presentation at OSAM. Things like the myths about speed bumps and rumble strips, lower limits, and the rest of it. The one thing I want to make sure we do, though, is that since this is a multi-year strategy, I think, yearly would likely get an update on how it went. I'd really be curious to see how the pace car piece goes, because if it's successful, wonderful, and I think it's a good idea if more and more people do it. If it's not, then it's a big part of our education piece. And if it's not successful, we have to change, pardon the pun, change gears relatively quickly and try something else education-wise. I do think it'll be a success, but it'll be really interesting to see year-to-year numbers after a year or two. Wonderful, wonderful report. I can't wait to support it.
John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, yeah, I'm 100% behind this as well. The one question I do have, and it's, I love the way this is all, lotted out in a long term, but I'm worried about this pace car thing. And the reason I say that, if we are, in essence, advertising people to be a pace car, to help us reduce speeds and that sort of thing, and by the nature of the name of it, we're asking them to drive the speed limit and, do that sort of, would we be liable for anything if they were, because they were driving the speed limit, if they got into accidents or anything like that? Again, I think it's a great idea and I think it could help, but I'm just curious about that aspect of it. Does that leave us open to any potential suits? Unfortunately, I have to go there.
I'll pass that on to the CAO and he can respond, and then I think we'll call the question.
Mr. Chair, I don't know that. I know that the pace car, the Parachute Canada, they have a package, so our staff will be dealing with them, and we can raise that at the time and see what we need to do. There's apparently a pledge that we would ask people to sign, whether there's some liability language in that, I'm not sure, but we can certainly look into that.
Okay, and just before I do call the question, I didn't give the author of the report a lot of time to speak to it. If you want to just take a moment and highlight your report, it's been well received, obviously, and I think it's going to pass, but if you wish to comment, this is your opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have a lot of specific comments. I think that it did, first of all, I appreciate council putting extra money in the budget to allow us to implement something as opposed to us kind of talking about it a lot and then trying to, fit it into an existing budget that's got other purposes. So I think that was a proactive step on council's part, and I want to thank all the contributors to the report, several of our folks here, as well as Inspector Anderson over at the OPP. It was nice to have a bunch of people work on something and bring something that's obviously been fairly well received. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, then, having heard that, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? It's carried unanimously. And that gives you the opportunity to continue speaking with your update.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I only have one item, just other than noting that May, it tends to be quite a busy month and is not really apparent in the fact that most of us don't have general managers' reports, I think, because all of us have been at so many meetings and so many topics recently, we don't have anything left to say. But the only thing I would mention is the strategic planning process is moving along. I think it's a little bit behind schedule, but not too much. April 17th, which was just after the last CDC meeting, we did have an open house and public meeting. We had 125 attendees at the open house and 45 at the public meeting, which we would consider to be a good turnout. And then we had a very extensive public input process, and we actually had 651 responses to that, which we would consider to be very positive. So. This Wednesday is council's working session with our facilitator. I personally feel he did a great job with the public session. He and I have laid out a bit of a 4-hour event for council to go through, and I'm looking forward to it. Anything I've heard about him from other colleagues say that he's great at this, and what we saw at the first public meeting, I think, confirmed that. So that's this Wednesday, and after that, then I will be going away with my staff team, and we'll be drafting a background document and a draft strategic plan, which we would hope to get to council in June. So that's my report, Mr. Chair.
Thanks. And then that allows us to move on. Communications, we have a communication from the Paris Ringette Association that requires a response, I believe. How do you wish to deal with that? Brian?
Put that on the floor, and I would make a motion that we give them $1,000.
So it's moved by Brian that the communication be received and that the request that a donation of $1,000 be made, or a grant of $1,000 be made. Do I have a seconder? John? Any comments, questions? First of all, comments, the mover?
Not a comment towards the ringette. My comment is, I know we're getting close on the limit on how much money, and so I'm well aware of that. Thank you. Hopefully we can find it.
Okay, it's got to be there somewhere. John?
Yes, I'm in support of this. Had the good fortune 2 years ago when the Finland children were here On Friday night, my wife and I were at Swiss Chalet, and the place was full. And I happened to know one of the individuals that is a coach. Her name is Carolyn Sales, right on farm up the road here north of Paris. And I asked her what all these children were. And she said they're a group from Finland here to play ringette with us. And I was quite enthused. They just weren't in Paris. They were supporting one of our local restaurants. I don't think Swiss Chalet was giving them a free meal that night. They were paying. So I'm in support of this, and if Brian wants to increase the amount, I'll still second it.
Well, we'll leave it as it is for the time being unless there's an amendment. And seeing no further comments, I will call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion is carried. And the second communication is a request for a contribution to the National Wall of Remembrance Association. How does committee wish to deal with that? A motion to receive would be in order. David?
I'll move to receive, and I'll also move that we donate $199.99.
So the motion is that the communication be received and that a grant of, or a contribution of $199.99, did you say?
Well, that gets you as a business sponsor,
Okay.
business card, and there might be tax HST on that, I'm not sure, but if there is, I would put that in as well.
Could we make that $200 just? Okay. Okay, well, 199, that's the motion. Do I have a seconder? Joan seconds it. Any comments before I call the question? Joan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I was surprised to see they're including the War of 1812, which we have many fallen veterans from Brant County, and they're recognized in our local cemeteries through the Heritage Committee. And they have several in the Oakland Pioneer Cemetery. So I fully support this, and sometime when we're up in Kingston, we can visit this monument. So thank you.
Okay, it's moved and seconded that the contribution of $199.99 be made. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion is carried. There are no matters referred by council. Other business, David wishes to speak about OSUM.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just indulge me for 90 seconds. As Mark pointed out, there was a great presentation on speeding and whatnot, and the whole conference, there was a lot of great presentations. And I want to touch on one because it ties into what we just seen at social services at our last meeting. And there's layoffs already within our community, and this is hitting at the child daycare level. We can't say how many or whatnot because that's still in camera, has to be passed by council. But there, and I think you guys on the conservation authorities, you see it as well. There was cuts, public health, there's cuts, ambulance services, they're putting those guys from 50 to 10. And there's a few other changes. The bottom line is Matthew Wilson from AMO. If you guys read any AMO stuff, you'll see Matthew Wilson there enough. He's a senior policy analyst. He's one of the brightest guys I've ever met. And he laid it out for us really clear. He said of every dollar, so just follow this if you can, it's better on a presentation, but of every dollar that the provincial government spends, 82 cents goes to what he calls transfers. In other words, it goes directly to school boards, directly to hospitals, long-term care facilities, public health, whatnot. It goes directly to them. So that's 82 cents of every dollar. There's 18 cents remaining. Divide that in half, 9 cents and 9 cents. 9 cents funds all the provincial ministries that we're familiar with. So forestry, Ministry of the Environment, Ministry of Finance, whatever, Ministry of Transportation. So 9 cents of every dollar that the provincial government spends goes to that, run those. And almost exact equal amount, 9 cents, goes to the interest, just the interest on the debt. And the debt's still accumulating despite all the quote-unquote cuts that they said. So all he's saying is we're going to see more of this. This is just the tip of the iceberg. The unfortunate part is, of that 82 cents on every dollar that goes to transfer payments, it's about $132, give or take. Only 4.1 billion goes to municipalities. So the municipalities portion of it that we get directly in grants from the government is quite small. So I thought it was a really good presentation, because he took those numbers, he put it in order for everybody, laid it out, and it really explains why we're seeing what we're going to see and continue to see. So, and one other thing, in light of the fact that we're trying to strengthen our connections with our neighboring municipalities, OSOM is looking for a host for next year, and I'm hoping maybe Brant County could be that host.
Okay, thanks, David. Usually the presentations made at these conferences are available, and perhaps the presentation that you're referring to could be searched out by staff and maybe circulated in the Friday file, and I think that might be instructional and educational. Okay, so we're at the point where we have to go in camera. We don't have to, but we probably will. Do I have a motion to go in camera to deal with the matters listed on the agenda A, B, and C without naming them? It's moved by Joan, seconded by Mark, that we go in camera to discuss A, B, and C as indicated on the agenda. All those in favor? Motion is carried. So the people in the audience are now asked to either